I learned to stop calling them people around the third month of the war, because caring made the job harder, and the job was the only thing keeping anyone alive. Sergeant Hollins, 22 years old, recipient of 2 commendations for field repair under fire, lay strapped to my stretcher with his legs fused into a single trunk of bone and muscle that ended in something like a foot but shaped wrong, toes pointed in 4 directions. He was crying, not from pain, from knowing what came next. "Leave me," he said. "Just leave me here." I checked the bone pins holding his restraints, secure. The pins were necessary because transformed tissue had a habit of trying to separate and crawl toward food sources. Even when the brain was still inside, still giving orders, the body stopped listening. 18 minutes to quarantine, I said. Stay still. My gunship, officially designated a Medevac 7, unofficially called a bone cage because of the ribbed composite frame that kept it light enough to fly, cut through airspace crowded with things that used to be soldiers. Tissue kites drifted in the thermals, pale sheets of skin stretched between cartilage struts, their edges ragged from artillery fragments. Higher up, hunter flocks circled. 12 of them today, white as exposed bone, each one built from a human rib cage that had learned to fly. They carried cartilage harpoons on braided tendon lines and muscle winches where their breastbones should have been. One good strike, and they could reel an aircraft down like a hooked fish. I kept the rotor disc angled low and used the wrecks below as windbreaks. "They're going to cut me apart in quarantine," Hollins said, his voice cracked. "Piece by piece until they figure out what went wrong." "They're going to stabilize you," I said. "Keep you fed and hydrated while the science team works on a countermeasure." That was the official line. What actually happened in quarantine was above my clearance and none of my business. My business was extraction, transport, and delivery. Once I handed the cargo over, someone else carried the weight. Hollins went quiet. I heard him breathing through his nose, short, fast cycles like he was trying not to scream. "You ever think about what we were supposed to be?" he asked. I adjusted altitude and didn't answer. The bone cage's shrouded rotor ring made a sound like canvas ripping when it bit into wind shear, loud enough to drown out questions I didn't want to hear. Below us, the battlefield wasn't a battlefield anymore. It was an ecosystem. Custodian mills, human torsos with their spines reworked into segmented crawlers and their rib cages split into grinding jaws, combed through crash sites and chewed on warm metal. They looked like mechanical street sweepers made from meat. Every few seconds one would stop, tilt its jaw assemblies toward the sky, and click a pattern that sounded almost like Morse code. Calling to something. Reporting, maybe. The plague had built a language we couldn't crack. I toggled my radio to base frequency. Mercy 3-1 inbound with cargo. Single occupant, stage 1 fusion, stable for transfer. Request quarantine barge clearance. The response came back in 4 seconds. Clearance granted. Barge 14 Western Dock. Unload and return to standby. Acknowledged. Hollins made a sound that could have been a laugh or a sob. "Cargo," he said. "That's what I am now. That's what keeps me flying," I said. It was the truth. The moment I started seeing patients as people instead of cargo, I started hesitating. Hesitation in a bone cage gunship got you harpooned. Hesitation on the ground got you surrounded by custodian mills that could crack a skull like a walnut. I'd seen pilots freeze up trying to decide if a voice calling for help was human or a voice lure node, a growth made from harvested throats that mimicked squad radio chatter to bait rescue crews into kill zones. The pilots who stopped to think died listening to recordings of their own friends screaming. I didn't stop to think. I followed the protocol. Load, transport, deliver. Repeat until the shift ended or the rotor gave out. The quarantine barge rose into view, a floating platform grown from compressed spinal segments and reinforced with steel plating, its surface dotted with isolation cells that looked like oversized ribs arching over containment pits. I brought the bone cage in low, flared the rotor to scrub speed, and settled onto the landing grid with a thump that made Hollins gasp. Two handlers in sealed suits met me at the cargo door. They unhooked Hollins from my stretcher without speaking, transferred him to a wheeled gurney, and rolled him towards cell 19A. He twisted his neck to look back at me. "Rook," he said, my call sign. "If I don't—" "You will," I said. The cell door sealed behind him with a sound like ribs snapping shut. I refueled at a forward operating rib, a mobile platform that used to be a supply depot before the plague converted it into something that could crawl on 6 femur-thick legs, and was halfway through my pre-flight checklist when the radio activated, an old medevac channel we'd stopped using after the voice lures learned to mimic it. "Mercy 3-1, this is Private Jacob Miles requesting immediate extraction." I almost ignored it. Voice lures pulled that trick 6 times a shift, but something in the cadence was wrong. Too slow, too careful, like someone picking their way through a conversation in a language they hadn't spoken in months. "Authenticate," I said, keying my transmit. "What's your unit designation?" "2nd Medical Battalion, Research Lab 7. A pause. Static washed through the channel. "I don't have a unit anymore. I don't have much of anything." "Then why are you calling for extraction?" "Because I remember the vaccine protocol," the voice said. "And if you don't get me out of here in the next 30 minutes, that information dies with me." My hand hovered over the throttle. Vaccine protocol. We'd been chasing that ghost since the war started. Some theoretical countermeasure that could teach the plague to recognize inoculated tissue and leave it alone. Command had burned through 4 research labs trying to crack it. Lab 7 had been the last attempt before the brass gave up and decided containment was cheaper than cure. "What's your current position?" The voice rattled off coordinates. I punched them into my nav system and felt my jaw tighten. Field clinic, crater section, right in the middle of what used to be a forward aid station before it got swallowed by biological growth. "That's a contaminated zone," I said. "No extraction authorized." "I know what it is," the voice said. "I've been here for 16 days, please." The word came out ragged, like someone who'd been practicing how to make sound through a voice box that didn't belong to them anymore. I kicked the rotor into spin and lifted off before I could second-guess myself. The clinic had collapsed into itself, walls overtaken by growth that looked like muscle wrapped around bone scaffolding. Artillery spores, fist-sized pods that drifted on air currents and exploded when they detected motion, bobbed in the approach corridor. I came in fast and low, using the crater rim as cover, and set down on a patch of cracked concrete that looked stable enough to hold the bone cage's weight. I grabbed my clampweave kit and a hemofoam cartridge, unbolted the cockpit seal, and stepped into air that tasted like wet clay. "Miles," I called. "Sound off." "Inside," the voice said. Quieter now, coming from deeper in the wreckage. I moved through the clinic's remains, stepping over tangles of nerve clusters that had burst through the floor tiles like tree roots. My saint's hands gloves, sensor-lined surgical gloves that read nerve activity through pressure, picked up faint electrical signatures from the walls. The growth wasn't dormant. It was watching. I found him in what used to be a storage room. Him. It. The thing that called itself Jacob Miles. A human arm, shoulder to fingertips. Nerves extended from the shoulder socket like pale roots, anchoring it to the floor and walls. The fingers moved, tapping a rhythm on the concrete. Near the wrist, a cluster of vocal cords, salvaged from somewhere, twitched and shaped words. "Thank you for coming," it said. I stared. My training said to call for an incinerator strike and walk away. My instinct said the same thing. But my gloves were telling me something different. The nerve patterns in that arm weren't division cycles. They were focus, distress, the same readings I'd see in a conscious patient trying to stay calm while I worked. "You're a limb colony," I said. "I'm Private Jacob Miles," it said. "Or I was." Now I'm what's left. Limb colonies don't talk. This one does. The fingers curled and uncurled. Lab 7 was working on inoculation synthesis, 3-stage process. I was assigned to assist, hold equipment, prep samples, standard tech work. When the outbreak hit, I watched the lead researcher walk through the whole protocol before her hands started splitting into mandibles. She got to stage 2.7 before she couldn't speak anymore. I wrote down what I could. Then I started changing. The vocal cords rippled. I heard something that might have been a laugh or a cough. I held on to the notes, it said. Held on to everything I could. Then I realized the notes didn't matter. I remembered the steps. All of them. Heat, fold, sequence, integrate. I can tell you what compounds to combine and in what order. I can tell you what temperature breaks the RNA and what saves it. I can give you stage 2.7 and everything after. Why would I believe you? Because I'm still here, it said. I've been surrounded by custodian mills for 16 days. They don't touch me. Hunter flocks pass overhead and don't dive. The growth around this building, look at it. Really look. I did. The nerve clusters I'd stepped over weren't bursting randomly. They were forming a perimeter, a barrier. They know what I carry, the limb said. They're protecting it, or trying to retrieve it. I'm not sure which. But if you leave me here, the information goes with me, back into the ecosystem. Lost. My radio activated. Command frequency. Mercy 3-1, we have your position flagged at contaminated Site 7-7. Explain your status. I looked at the limb, at the fingers that moved like a person's fingers, at the nerve patterns on my glove display that showed intention. False contact, I said into the radio, investigating possible equipment cache. Negative, exit the zone immediately. Napalm strike authorized for Site 7-7 in 90 seconds. The limb's fingers went still. Please, it said. I pulled the clamp weave from my kit, subcutaneous clamps with braided line designed to lash mobile tissue to a carrier's harness without feeding growth, and dropped to one knee. The limb didn't resist when I anchored the clamps to its shoulder and threaded the line through my chest harness. Command, this is Mercy 3-1. I'm extracting research material from Site 7-7. Hold the strike. Negative extraction. Standing order is incineration of all. I switched off the radio and ran. The bone cage was still idling where I'd left it. I strapped the limb into the co-pilot's harness, its fingers gripping the restraint straps like it was afraid of falling. I bolted the cockpit seal, kicked the rotor into full pitch, and pulled collective until the gunship clawed into the air. Behind us, the clinic disappeared in a wall of flame. The limb made a sound through its vocal cords, low, shuddering, almost like a sob. I didn't let go, it said. Kara told me not to let go. Who's Kara? Nurse, Lab 7. She was holding my shoulder when I started changing. She said if I let go of who I was, I'd lose everything. The fingers tightened on the straps. I didn't let go. I didn't respond. I was too busy watching the horizon. 12 hunter flocks rose from the ridgeline ahead of us, bone white and coordinated. Their harpoons were already cocked. The limb whispered, "They know what I carry." The first harpoon punched through the gunship's frame behind my seat with a sound like a spike driven through wet wood. I had 1 second to register the cartilage tip buried in the composite, pale and ridged like a talon, before the tendon line went taut. The bone cage lurched sideways. My harness cut into my shoulders as the entire aircraft tilted 40 degrees. The limb made a sound I didn't have a word for. 3 more harpoons hit in rapid sequence, 1 through the tail boom, 2 through the cargo bay floor. The hunter flocks weren't trying to kill us. They were rigging us for retrieval, threading lines through structural hardpoints the way you'd lash cargo to a pallet. I watched the tendon cables snap straight, vibrating with tension, and felt the muscle winches embedded in the flock's breastbones start to reel. We were being pulled down. I cut engine power and reached for the collective. The rotor was still spinning, momentum from the climb, but without power it would slow fast. Too fast if I didn't control the descent. I pushed the cyclic forward and let the rotor freewheel, trading altitude for spin. Auto-rotation. The last resort for a pilot with no thrust and one chance to not die on impact. My hands moved through the procedure while my brain caught up. Release cockpit seal bolts, 3 twists counterclockwise. The seal popped with a hiss of equalized pressure, and I shoved it aside, one hand still on the collective. The limb was cinched tight to my chest harness, fingers white-knuckled on the straps, its rootlets pulled tight against the shoulder socket like a person bracing for a crash. "Hold on," I said. The ground came up fast. A plain of fused vertebrae and shattered armor plate, cratered from old artillery strikes, surface slick with something that looked like condensation, but moved wrong when the wind touched it. I flared the rotor at the last second, dumping airspeed, and the bone cage hit like a hammer striking an anvil. The impact went through my spine and into my skull. My teeth clacked together. The collective tore out of my grip, and the gunship pitched forward, rotor blades biting dirt. Metal screamed. The frame buckled. I took the collision across my shoulders and knees, harness straps cutting bruises deep enough to feel like cracks in the bone. Then everything stopped. I hung in the harness for 3 seconds, waiting for pain that didn't arrive, and unclipped myself. The limb was still strapped in place, trembling so hard its fingers blurred. I reached over and touched its wrist, just contact, checking, and felt the frantic pulse of electrical activity through my gloves. "Still here," I said. It didn't respond. I forced the cockpit door open with my shoulder, frame warped, hinges bent, and dropped to the ground. My right knee gave out halfway down and I caught myself on the gunship's landing skid, weight on my left leg, jaw locked against the spike of pain climbing my thigh. Something in the joint had twisted or torn. I could still walk. Running would be a problem. The custodian mills arrived before I'd taken 10 steps. 3 of them, crawling across the vertebrae field on segmented spines that flexed and contracted like inchworms. Their rib cages had split into grinding mandibles, each rib sharpened to a cutting edge, and they were already working on the gunship's torn plating. One of them bit through the cargo bay door and started chewing toward the battery core. The sound was like gravel in a garbage disposal. I pulled my clamp weave kit from the cockpit and grabbed 2 hemofoam cartridges from the emergency locker. The limb was still strapped in. I cinched the clamp weave tighter against my chest and it immediately wrapped its fingers around my wrist, grip tight enough to hurt. "I need you to let go," I said. The fingers loosened. Barely. I threaded the clamp weave line through the limb's shoulder anchor points, metal clips with subcutaneous barbs designed to hold tissue without triggering growth, and secured it to my chest harness. The limb pressed against my flight jacket, rootlets brushing the fabric. I felt a faint electric buzz where they made contact, like touching a battery terminal with wet fingers. A voice called my name. "Rook, Rook, where are you? Rook, I need extraction." My own voice, exact cadence, same flat tone I used on the radio when I was trying to stay calm and failing. I looked south, 50 meters across the vertebrae field. A voice lure node squatted on a pile of corroded plating. It was the size of a car engine, built from a dozen human throats nested together like organ pipes, their vocal cords still pink and functional. It called again, cycling through phrases it had harvested from intercepted transmissions. "Rook, please respond. Rook, I'm hit. Rook, come get me." I turned away and started pulling equipment from the cargo bay. The custodian mills were getting closer to the battery. Once they cracked it open, the lithium cells would ignite and turn the crash site into a fireball. I had maybe 3 minutes. The rotor ring had sheared off during impact, landing 10 meters away. It was a circle of reinforced composite about as wide as I was tall. I dragged it over to the gunship and started loading supplies onto it like a sled. Hemofoam, water pouches, a signal flare, a folding trauma kit. My knee screamed every time I put weight on it. The limb tapped my chest. 3 times, fast rhythm. I looked down. It was pointing with its smallest finger, the one that still had a nail, toward a gap in the bone hedgerows that ringed the crash site. Not a random direction, a specific path. "You know where we're going?" I asked. The finger tapped twice. "Yes." I looped the rotor ring's dragline over my shoulder and started walking. The limb pressed tighter against my chest, rootlets shifting under my jacket like it was trying to find better purchase. Every few steps it would point again, adjusting our heading, steering us away from the custodian mill patrol routes. Behind us, the battery core caught fire. The explosion was a muted thump, followed by a wave of heat that pushed against my back like a hand shoving me forward. We moved through the hedgerows, chest-high barriers of fused spinal segments and armor fragments grown together over months of uncontrolled tissue spread. And the world changed. An environment with rules. Sentry tumors dotted the gaps between hedgerows. Each one was the size of a trash bin, rooted to the ground by a tangle of nerve clusters, its surface covered in pressure-sensitive nodules that swiveled to track movement. When something taller than a kneeling human passed within range, they fired. I'd seen the needles punch through Kevlar and bone, 3-inch slivers of calcified cartilage, sharp enough to core an apple. The limb tapped my chest again. 3 fast, 2 slow. I stopped, looked at the pattern. Old airfield signal for advance undercover. You remember ground crew codes? I asked. 1 tap. Yes. I dropped to my stomach and started crawling. The rotor ring scraped along behind me, supplies rattling in the makeshift sled. My knee sent sparks of pain up my leg every time I dragged it forward, and my left shoulder, wrenched during the crash, ground in its socket like there was sand in the joint. I reached up, braced my hand against the rotor ring's edge, and shoved. The shoulder popped back into place with a wet click that made my vision white out for half a second. The limb made a sound like a caught breath. I'm fine, I said. It curled 2 fingers around the collar of my flight jacket and held on. We crawled for 20 minutes. The sentry tumors tracked us but didn't fire, too low to trigger their height sensors. By the time we cleared the field, my knee had swollen enough that I could feel the joint grinding against the inside of my flight pants. The limb pointed toward the east, still leading. I checked my internal map. 2 kilometers to Halverson's supply cache, a forward depot he'd buried in a wrecked troop carrier before the plague turned the sector into a hunting ground. If it hadn't been stripped by custodian mills, there would be rotor pins, hemofoam, and maybe an emergency beacon. If we could get there before dark, we had a chance. After dark, the hunter flock switched to thermal tracking. They'd find us in minutes. I pulled the limb tighter against my chest and kept walking. A custodian mill crawled past us 30 meters south, its mandibles working on a chunk of something that used to be a fuel tank. It paused, tilted its jaw assemblies toward us, and clicked a pattern. 3 short, 1 long, 2 short. Then it turned away and kept crawling. The limb's rootlets twitched against my ribs. It saw us, I said. The limb tapped once. Yes. Why didn't it attack? Escort exception, it said. We found the troop carrier an hour before sunset. The vehicle had been flipped onto its side and half buried by tissue growth, but Halverson's cache was where he'd said it would be, welded inside a false compartment under the driver's seat. I pried the panel open with a piece of rebar and pulled out the supplies. Rotor pins, hemofoam, water, and an emergency beacon, unpowered, battery terminals corroded, useless without a charge. I sat down hard, knee finally giving out, and stared at the dead beacon. The limb shifted against my chest and pointed at the beacon's terminals. Then at itself. No, I said. It tapped my sternum. Insistent. I'm not running electrical current through you, your tissue, living tissue. The fingers curled and uncurled. Then the vocal cords twitched. Bioelectric field, it said. Nerve clusters generate current. Not much, maybe enough. Or it kills you. Then I'm dead, it said. But if we don't call for extraction, we're both dead. I looked at the beacon, at the limb, at the darkening sky where hunter flocks were already beginning to circle. The beacon's supercapacitor only needed a boot pulse. Once awake, it sipped microamps. I pulled 2 wires from the beacon's battery housing and touched them to the limb's shoulder socket, where the rootlets clustered thickest. The limb convulsed, its fingers locked rigid, nails digging into my jacket. The rootlets flared bright under the skin, white-hot lines of electrical discharge, and the beacon's display flickered to life. I keyed the transmit switch and broadcast extraction coordinates. The response came back in 70 seconds. Negative extraction. Authorized to fire on biogrowth. Terminate an evac solo. The limb heard it. I felt the rootlets go slack, felt the fingers loosen their grip. I switched off the beacon and tucked it into my jacket. "We're still walking," I said. The limb didn't respond. I pulled myself upright, looped the drag line over my shoulder, and started east. The pain in my knee had gone from sharp to numb, which meant something important had stopped working. I didn't look at it. Looking wouldn't help. The limb pointed ahead, still leading. We cleared the last hedgerow as the sun dropped below the horizon, and that's when I saw them. Shapes moving in the distance, low and fast. Not custodian mills, something else. I counted 7 before I lost track. They were flanking us, pacing our speed, staying just far enough back that I couldn't make out details. The limb tapped my chest. Fast. Urgent. I picked up the pace, dragging the rotor ring behind me, and tried not to think about how much noise we were making, how easy we'd be to follow. The sky above us split open. Drones. Friendly surveillance drones. Their cameras tracking movement across the sector, feeding data back to automated defense systems. One of them swooped lower, spotlight locking onto my chest where the limb was strapped. Then it released the veil. Enzyme countermeasure. Airborne solvent in aerosol form, designed to liquefy exposed tissue and prevent mutation spread. It drifted down like fog, pale and faintly luminescent, and where it touched organic material it melted straight through. I had 5 seconds. I grabbed the rotor ring, flipped it on edge, and dove underneath. My body hit the ground and I curled around the limb, wrapping my arms and legs around it, covering every exposed surface with my own flesh. The enzyme veil settled over us like a weighted blanket made from acid. It burned through my flight jacket first, then the shirt underneath, then skin. The pain was immediate and absolute. Dissolution, my cells coming apart at the molecular level, protein chains snapping, nerve endings flooding my brain with distress signals faster than I could process them. I pressed my face into the dirt and locked my jaw, and refused to move because moving meant exposing the limb, and the limb was why I was still here. The veil lasted 30 seconds. When it cleared, I lay still for another 10, waiting for my body to confirm it still had all its parts. My neck and forearms were raw, skin gone, tissue underneath exposed and weeping clear fluid. My flight jacket hung in tatters, but the limb was intact. It trembled against my chest. Then the vocal cords twitched. "Thank you," it said. I didn't answer. I was too busy trying to remember how to breathe without screaming. The limb shifted, and I felt its rootlets extend. Just a fraction, just enough to brush the exposed tissue on my forearms where the enzyme had burned through. The contact was gentle, deliberate. And when I looked down, I saw the rootlets weren't feeding. They were anchoring, threading into my skin, braiding with my nerves. I pulled away enough to see. Small growths had begun to rise along my forearms. Thumb-sized buds, pale and tender, shaped like the knuckles of a clenched fist. I was infected. The limb's fingers found my wrist and squeezed once. "I'm sorry," it said. I got to my feet, pulled the rotor ring upright and kept walking. The growths on my forearms quivered in sync with my stride. They transmitted every impact, boot on vertebrae, shoulder against the rotor ring, knee grinding in its damaged socket, as vibration that traveled up the bone and into my skull, like someone had wired my skeleton to amplify sound. Every step was a frequency I couldn't escape. The limb felt it too. I knew because its fingers would tighten on my jacket whenever I stumbled, loosening only when I found my balance again. We moved through darkness cut by searchlight beams from automated watchtowers on both sides of the no man's land. Allied towers to the east, plague-held towers to the west. Neither recognized us as anything worth protecting, just movement, just targets if we crossed the wrong threshold. The hunter flocks were organizing. I'd counted 12 during the attack on the bone cage. Now I counted 30. They circled in a formation, spiraling inward with each pass, tightening the radius. They wanted the limb intact. A custodian mill crawled across our path and stopped. Its mandibles ground once, twice, then went still. Something wet and dense dropped from its jaw assemblies, a chunk of tissue the size of my fist. Still pink, nerve clusters twitching at the edges. Fresh enough to feed a colony for days. The limb's rootlets pulled tight against my ribs. The mill waited. 5 seconds. 10. Then it picked up the tissue, tucked it back into its mandibles and crawled away. "It was offering you food," I said. The limb tapped once. "Yes." "Why didn't you take it?" The fingers curled against my collarbone. "Because I'd have to grow. And if I grow, you can't carry me." We kept walking. 30 minutes later, another mill dropped tissue. Bigger chunk this time. I watched the limb's rootlets tremble, saw the way its shoulder socket contracted like a muscle clenching against hunger. It didn't feed. I pulled it tighter against my chest. The sentry corridor appeared an hour before dawn. I knew we'd reached it because the ground changed. Smooth vertebrae plain gave way to cratered terrain where overlapping fire arcs had chewed the surface into a maze of blast pits and shattered bone fragments. The tumors themselves were harder to spot, low profiles, surfaces textured to match the surrounding wreckage. But their pressure nodules caught the searchlight beams and reflected back in clusters of tiny crescents. 300 meters of overlapping kill zones. Anything taller than a crouch would get cawed. The limb tapped my chest. Long, short, long. I stopped and crouched. "I don't know that one." The vocal cords rippled. "Firing pattern. 4 seconds reload between bursts. Watch the nodules. They swell before discharge." "How do you know that?" "I've been watching them for 16 days. I studied the corridor. The tumor closest to us squatted in a shallow crater 20 meters ahead, its nodules tracking a piece of rubble drifting in the wind. The nodules swelled, visibly larger like pupils dilating, and a needle burst punched through the rubble with a wet thunk. 4 seconds later, the nodules swelled again. Another burst. 4 seconds, I said. The limb tapped twice. Yes. I dragged the rotor ring forward and positioned it like a shield, edge facing the tumor field. The limb adjusted its grip on my jacket, fingers finding the same holds a climber would use on a rock face, pressure points that wouldn't slip. Then it tapped my chest again. 3 times. Go. I moved during the reload gap. 10 steps, fast as my knee allowed, then froze when the limb's fingers went rigid. The nodules swelled. Needles ripped through the air where my head had been 2 seconds earlier. 4-second gap. The fingers loosened. I moved again. We crossed the corridor in 20-minute increments, timed to a rhythm the limb read from pressure changes I couldn't see. Halfway through, a voice called out, "Rook, I need help. Rook, please." Ames, my crew chief. His voice had the clipped urgency he used when something was wrong with the rotor assembly, and he needed me to shut down before the blades sheared. I looked left. 40 meters south, past 2 sentry tumors, a voice lure node sat in a cleared space that looked too clean to be accidental. The throats that made up the node were arranged in tiers, layered like an organ. "Rook, I can't feel my legs. Rook, don't leave me here." The node was synthesizing his voice in real time, pulling patterns from hours of intercepted radio traffic. Then it shifted tactic. The voice broke, cracked, went raw with pain. "Rook, they're pulling me apart." Screaming, real screaming. Audio captured from an actual engagement stitched into the call pattern to make it believable. I knew it wasn't Ames. Knew he was back at base, probably asleep in his rack or prepping the next gunship for rotation. The limb curled 2 fingers around my thumb and squeezed. Steady pressure. Not restraint, grounding. The same technique I'd used on shock patients who couldn't stop their hands from trembling during amputations. Contact without confinement, proof that someone was there. I counted 4 seconds and moved forward. The node kept calling for another 30 seconds, cycling through distress patterns, then went silent. We cleared the corridor without triggering a single tumor. The second enzyme veil came from nowhere. No warning, no drone spotlights, just a surveillance pass that read biogrowth on my chest and deployed countermeasure automatically. The veil drifted down in a sheet 3 meters wide, blocking the path to the perimeter, and I had no time to find cover. I ripped off what remained of my flight jacket, wrapped it around the limb twice, and pressed my body over it as the veil settled. The enzyme burned differently this time. It found the exposed muscle on my forearms and started working deeper, breaking down connective fibers, loosening the anchors that held tendon to bone. My vision went white at the edges, my jaw locked. I couldn't unclench it even when I tried. The limbs spoke through the wrapped jacket, voice muffled but clear. Stage 1 synthesis. Heat compound 7A to 93 degrees Celsius. Hold temperature for 6 minutes while folding RNA primer sequence B12 into the solution. You'll see precipitation. That's correct. Don't filter it. It was reciting the vaccine protocol, keeping its mind anchored while I took the pain. Stage 2. Introduce enzyme catalyst R7 at 1.2 milliliter intervals. Wait 40 seconds between each addition. The solution will turn from clear to amber. If it goes brown, you've added too fast and the RNA is degraded. Start over. The enzyme ate through the skin on my shoulders and started on the muscle underneath. My mouth was bleeding where I'd bitten through my lower lip. Stage 3. Final integration. Temperature dropped to 18 degrees over 12 minutes. Stable integration shows as crystalline structure suspended in solution. Under microscope, it looks like snowflakes. Kara said it looked like snowflakes. The limb's voice changed. Higher pitch. Younger. She was holding my shoulder when I started changing. I was scared. She said, "Don't let go of who you are. Don't let the mutation erase you." I asked her how. She said, "Remember something that matters." So I remembered the protocol. Every step, every temperature. I said it back to her until my mouth stopped working. Lower pitch now. Older. Exhausted. My nickname was Lucky. Got it after an artillery strike hit my transport and I walked away with a concussion and a broken finger. Everyone else died. I didn't feel lucky. But they called me that anyway. The enzyme veil lifted. The air cleared. I lay still for 10 seconds, waiting for my nervous system to confirm I was still connected to my limbs. The growths on my forearms had spread more numerous. They ran from wrist to elbow in a line of pale buds. The limb's rootlets had threaded deeper during the attack, anchoring itself to me while I protected it. I unwrapped the jacket. The limb's fingers were locked rigid, nails dug into the fabric. It took 15 seconds before they loosened enough for me to pry free. "You kept talking," I said. "You kept holding on," it said. I got to my feet. My shoulders were raw meat. My forearms looked like they'd been skinned. The growths along the bone sent feedback with every movement. Vibration, pressure, temperature changes I'd never felt before. I could sense the hunter flocks circling overhead through the displacement of air against the buds. The perimeter was half a kilometer ahead. I could see the wire now. 3-meter fence topped with razored composite, towers every 50 meters, automated turrets covering the approach with overlapping fire cones. The targeting lasers were already active, sweeping the ground in search of threats. I started walking. The limb pressed against my chest, fingers gripping my shirt where the jacket had been. Behind us, the hunter flocks dropped lower. In front of us, the turret lasers painted red dots across the ground, tracking movement. I keyed my radio to open broadcast. "This is Sergeant Rook Delgado, call sign Mercy 3-1, approaching Allied perimeter from Sector 7 with research material. Request immediate gate access and quarantine escort." The response came back in 3 seconds. "Negative approach, biogrowth detected. Automated defenses are active. Clear the area." I'm carrying vaccine synthesis data, live source. If I turn around, the information is lost. Sergeant, you are contaminated. Our protocols are clear. I looked down at the limb, at the bony growths on my arms that marked me as infected, at the line of turrets that would fire the moment I crossed their threshold. The limb's fingers found my wrist and squeezed once. I took a step forward, then another. The targeting lasers locked onto my chest. The hunter flocks dove, 30 bone-white kites dropping in a spiral formation, harpoons cocked, tendon lines trailing behind them like streamers. They weren't targeting me, they were targeting the space around me, threading lines through the air to build a cage. I raised the rotor ring overhead and kept walking. The first harpoon grazed the ring's edge and skittered off. The second punched through and lodged in the composite, tendon lines snapping taut. I felt the pull, not enough to stop me, but enough to slow me down. Another harpoon hit, then 3 more. The ring became a net anchor, lines crossing and recrossing as the flock circled. Behind me, custodian mills broke from cover. 6 of them, crawling at speed, mandibles grinding. They weren't after me. They were moving toward any heat source in the kill zone, but they'd take whatever they could find, including the emergency beacon still tucked in my jacket pocket. Ahead, the turrets tracked. Red laser dots painted my chest, my legs, the bundle strapped to my harness. Acquisition locks, one command away from firing. Sentry tumors on both sides of the no-man's land swelled and fired. Needles from the plague-held sector ripped through the air to my left. Needles from the Allied perimeter tore past my right shoulder. Neither side recognized me. I was just movement in the kill zone. The limb began reciting again. Stage 1 synthesis, heat compound 7A to 93 degrees Celsius. Not for itself this time, broadcasting on open channel, every word transmitted to anyone listening. A harpoon caught my leg. Not deep. Cartilage tip hooked the fabric of my flight pants and jerked me sideways. I stumbled, caught myself on the rotor ring, and kept moving. My knee gave out halfway through the next step, and I went down on the other leg, rings scraping the ground. The custodian mills closed to 50 meters. I dragged myself upright and pushed forward. The bony growths on my forearms sent feedback with every impact. Vibration traveling up the bone, frequencies I'd never sensed before. I could feel the turret servos adjusting their aim through the displacement of air against the buds. Could sense the hunter flock's wing membranes flexing as they prepared for another pass. The infection had rewired my nervous system. I wasn't just carrying the mutation anymore, I was becoming it. 20 meters to the wire. The limb's voice jumped octaves, cycling between the child's pitch and the veteran's rasp. 10 meters. The turrets locked, all of them. Every targeting laser converged on the limb strapped to my chest. I stopped, raised both arms to show I was unarmed. The rotor ring dangled from one hand, harpoon lines still attached, hunter flocks pulling against the weight like kites in a storm. "This is Sergeant Rook Delgado," I said into the open channel. My voice came out calm. Medevac report cadence. Case facts. No emotion. Approaching with Private Jacob Miles, survivor of Research Lab 7 outbreak. Subject has retained full cognitive function and memory of vaccine synthesis protocol. I am contaminated through prolonged contact. Tissue integration non-aggressive but progressing, requesting immediate lab access for subject, full quarantine for myself, and disciplinary review after transfer. I lowered my arms, the limb pressed tighter against my chest. "Subject is a person," I said. "Not cargo, not a specimen, a soldier carrying mission-critical intelligence through hostile territory. What we save here determines whether anyone else survives intact." The channel stayed silent for 5 seconds. Then the limb spoke. "Kara said not to let go," it said. Its voice was soft, raw, human. "I didn't." Static washed through the channel. Then a woman's voice, different from command, with the careful pronunciation of someone who spent their days reading compound names and synthesis procedures. "This is Dr. Santos, Lab Division. Jacob, I need you to repeat stage 2.4 through 2.7. The limb's fingers tightened on my shirt. Enzyme catalyst R7. 40 seconds between additions. Amber coloration indicates correct integration. Brown means degraded RNA. Discard and restart from stage 1.8. Who taught you that verification step? Dr. Santos asked. You did, the limb said. 6 months ago. You said I had good hands for delicate work. Another pause. Longer this time. Cease fire, Dr. Santos said. Gate clearance authorized. Quarantine team to entry point 6. The targeting lasers switched off. The turrets pivoted away. The gate, a section of razor wire mounted on hydraulic rails, ground open. I walked through. The hunter flocks didn't follow. They circled the perimeter once, harpoon lines still trailing from my rotor ring, then broke formation and scattered back toward plague-held territory. The custodian mills stopped at the wire and went still, mandibles closing, as if they'd hit an invisible barrier they couldn't cross. The quarantine team met me 15 meters inside the perimeter. 4 personnel in sealed suits, carrying a containment cradle, a stretcher modified with neural interface ports and tissue restraints. I unclipped the clamp weave from my harness and transferred the limb to the cradle. Its fingers uncurled from my shirt slowly, reluctant, and found the cradle's handlebar instead. Thank you for holding on, it said. I nodded. Couldn't manage words. The team sealed the cradle and moved toward the lab complex at double time. Dr. Santos walked beside them, already asking questions, and the limb answered in its fractured voice, jumping between pitches as it recited procedures I'd listened to for 2 days straight. Someone touched my shoulder. I turned. Ames, my crew chief, standing 5 meters back, hands in his pockets. He'd been monitoring my radio traffic. Had to have been. Otherwise, he wouldn't be here. He didn't say anything, just looked at me, at the bony growths running up my forearms, at the raw tissue on my shoulders, at the shredded remains of my flight suit, and held eye contact. I nodded once. He nodded back. Then the medical team arrived and led me toward quarantine processing. 3 weeks later, I stood on the flight deck and watched them load the first inoculated patient into my bone cage. In the labs, Santos's team had reused Lab 7's preserved reagent stock and field bioreactors, letting them skip months of setup and scale production fast. His name was Corporal Nash, 31 years old. Stage 1 transformation, right arm splitting at the elbow into 2 functional limbs, each with 3 fingers and a thumb. The inoculation had stopped the progression. The splitting remained, but it wasn't spreading. He could hold a rifle, could work a radio, could function. He climbed into the co-pilot seat and strapped himself in, using both sets of hands to secure the harness. One of his new fingers trembled. He pinned it under a thumb, different hand, same gesture I used, and the trembling stopped. First time flying since the change? I asked. First time doing anything since the change, he said. They kept me in observation for 8 days. Made sure the vaccine held. Did it? He looked at his split arm, at the way the 2 limbs moved independently, coordinating without conscious thought. Mostly, he said. I checked the pre-flight sequence and powered up the rotor. The bone cage's frame rattled as the blades spun to speed, and the bony growths on my forearms vibrated in response, picking up the frequency, transmitting it straight to my nervous system. I could feel the rotor's balance through the feedback. Could sense a microfracture in the number 3 blade from the way the vibration stuttered every 4th rotation. The infection had made me better at my job. Mercy 3-1 requesting clearance for medevac transport, I said into the radio. Destination, Forward Medical Station 12. Clearance granted, the tower responded. Watch for hunter activity in Sector 4. I pulled collective and lifted off. Nash watched the ground fall away, his split arm resting on the armrest, fingers from both limbs interlaced like he was holding his own hand. Do you think the vaccine will hold long-term? He asked. I glanced at the growths on my forearms. They'd stopped spreading after the 2nd week, but they hadn't disappeared. They were part of me now, permanent. I'd been cleared for limited flight duty with the understanding that I was compromised. Not a full soldier anymore, not fully transformed, something in between. I think we carry what we have to carry, I said. And we see who we are when we do. He looked at me, at the growths, at the way I flew with one hand while the other rested on the collective, thumb pinning my trembling finger in place. They told me you brought the vaccine through on foot, he said, while carrying the source. The source had a name, I said. Jacob Miles, Private Jacob Miles. Is he still in the lab, neural cradle with interface ports? He's dictating synthesis procedures to Dr. Santos's team. They're scaling up production 67% stabilization rate for soldiers treated before Stage 2 transformation. Nash absorbed that. What about the other 33%? He asked. We're still working on it, I said. The bone cage cleared the perimeter and cut east toward the forward station. Below us, the battlefield spread out in a patchwork of plague-held territory and Allied ground, the line between them marked by kill zones and contested wreckage. Hunter flocks still circled, custodian mills still harvested, voice lure nodes still called out in familiar voices. The war hadn't ended. It had just changed shape. Nash settled into his seat, split arm finding a comfortable position against his chest, and looked out the window. After a minute, he spoke again. Do you still call us cargo? I thought about Hollins, strapped to my stretcher, begging to be left behind. About Jacob's hand, reciting vaccine protocols while enzyme veils dissolved my skin. About the moment I chose to walk into a firing arc rather than drop what I was carrying. No, I said. The flight to forward medical took 20 minutes. I brought the bone cage down smooth, transferred Nash to the station's medical team, and lifted off again for the next extraction. 3 more runs today, 4 tomorrow. Every patient half changed, half stable, half certain about what they'd become. I understood them now. In practice. In the tremor of mutated tissue responding to stress. In the way they held themselves carefully, like their bodies were fragile truces between what they'd been and what they were becoming. The rotor spun. The growths on my arms translated its rhythm into sensation I couldn't have named 3 weeks ago. And somewhere in the lab, Jacob's hand, still speaking, still fighting, still refusing to let go, gave Dr. Santos the next synthesis step, in a voice that jumped between registers like it was searching for the frequency that meant human. I keyed the radio to base frequency and confirmed my next coordinates. The war continued. I flew, and every patient I carried got a name.